October 14, 1942. Krakow occupied Poland. The German officer collapsed at dinner, his wineglass shattering on the marble floor of the General Government headquarters. By midnight, two more were admitted to the military hospital. By dawn, a fourth was dead. The SS physician who examined the bodies found no wounds, no poison in their food, no contamination in the water. The men had simply failed. Their hearts had slowed, their nervous systems had seized. It was as if the city itself had turned against them. Nobody suspected the seamstress. Nobody thought to ask about the uniforms. Her name was Marta Ostrowski, née Kolitz, and she was 31 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and had fingers so precise she could thread a needle in complete darkness. She had been altering German officers' uniforms for 14 months, and for the past 6 weeks, she had been killing them. Krakow in the autumn of 1942 smelled like coal smoke and fear. The Germans had occupied the city since September 1939, and in 3 years they had gutted it, shuttering the university, emptying the Jewish quarter, installing their administrative empire in Wall Castle, with its ancient towers overlooking a city that no longer belonged to its own people. The Poles who remained walked close to walls. They kept their eyes down. They spoke softly and chose their words carefully, because informers were everywhere, and the price of a careless sentence was a cellar on Montelupich Street. Marta had grown up above her father's tailor shop on Grodska Street, the second of 4 children, and from the age of 7, she had been handed a needle and thread and told to watch, to learn, to be still. Her father, Stefan Kollwitz, was the finest tailor in the city, a man who believed that clothing was a form of language, that the way a seam fell revealed everything about a person's character and ambitions. He addressed lawyers and professors and the occasional minor nobleman. He had an instinct for fabric that bordered on the mystical. Marta had inherited it all. By the time she was 20, she could construct a 3-piece suit from a single fitting. By 25, she had taken over most of the shop's skilled work while her father managed the ledgers and the clients. Her hands remembered measurements the way other people's minds remembered faces. She did not need to write things down. When the Germans came, they came with their iron crosses and their polished boots and their overwhelming mechanical certainty. They also came with uniforms that needed altering. It was Wehrmacht Hauptmann Werner Brandt who first brought his tunic to the shop on Grodska Street in November 1939. He had been told the Kollwitz shop was the best in Krakow. He was a man who cared about appearances, that much was immediately clear, and his uniform, while regulation, had been fitted carelessly somewhere in Germany and sat wrong across the shoulders. Marta altered it in 2 hours. She charged him nothing extra. She smiled the way she had learned to smile in those first months, carefully, with the lips only, nothing in the eyes. Brandt told his colleagues told theirs. By the spring of 1940, the Kollwitz shop had become something of an unofficial resource for German officers stationed in Krakow, who wanted their dress uniforms to look the way they imagined themselves, powerful, precise, worthy of the empire they believed they were building. Stefan Kollwitz was dead by then. He had died of a heart attack in January. Though Marta always suspected the grief had done most of the work, her brother Tomas had been taken by the Gestapo in March, for reasons never explained and never resolved. Her youngest sister Rosa had disappeared into the labor draft. Only Marta remained in the apartment above the shop, along with her husband Powell, who repaired bicycles in the back alley, and their 6-year-old daughter Sophia, who had her grandfather's eyes and her mother's careful stillness. Marta stitched German uniforms, and she said nothing, and she watched everything. She watched which officers drank too much. She watched which ones were cruel in small, revealing ways, kicking dogs, snapping at their orderlies, looking at Polish women on the street with an appetite they made no effort to conceal. She watched which ones seemed almost embarrassed by what their country had become, and she noted that even those ones did nothing about it. She kept a notebook written in a private shorthand she had invented. Names, ranks, addresses, habits. The notebook was hidden inside the lining of a winter coat she never wore, hanging at the back of a wardrobe. She did not yet know what she would do with this information. She only knew she needed to see clearly, to understand the machinery she was embedded in, so that when the moment came, if the moment came, she would not hesitate from ignorance. The moment came in the form of a plant. It was Judwika Wierzbicka who first mentioned it, an old herbalist who sold medicinal preparations from a basket near the Cloth Hall, one of the few street vendors the Germans had not yet cleared away. Jadwiga was 70 years old and had the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had decided long ago that the world moved too fast and she would simply wait for it to catch up. She and Marta had known each other for years, the way people know each other in old cities, not intimately, but with the easy familiarity of shared geography. One afternoon in the summer of 1942, while Marta was choosing dried herbs for a winter tincture, Jadwiga had said, almost to herself, the monks at Tinius used aconitine on arrow tips, from the wolfsbane. Beautiful flower. Kills through the skin. Marta had bought her herbs and walked home without speaking. She did not sleep that night. Aconitine. Aconitine napellus. Wolfsbane. Monkshood. She knew the plant. It grew in mountain meadows, sometimes in garden borders, with its hooded purple flowers that looked almost gentle. She knew it was poisonous if ingested. She had not known it could be absorbed dermally, through the skin. She spent 2 weeks reading everything she could find. Her father had kept a surprisingly comprehensive botanical reference in his personal library, left over from a brief period when he had experimented with natural fabric dyes. There was also a pre-war pharmacology handbook and a volume on historical toxicology that had been given to her by a university professor who had briefly been a client before the university was shuttered. She was careful, methodical, and patient. She took notes in her shorthand. The chemistry was, in its essentials, straightforward. An alkaloid extract from the plant, dissolved in a carrier agent. She experimented with lanolin, with linseed oil, with a light mineral preparation, could be applied to fabric in concentrations that would survive multiple wearings before losing their potency. Absorption through the skin of the neck or wrists would be slow. The onset of effects, dizziness, cardiac irregularity, progressive neurological disruption could be delayed by hours. It would look like illness, like coincidence. The first time she applied the preparation to a uniform, her hand shook so badly, she had to stop and sit down for 10 minutes. The uniform belonged to Obersturmführer Klaus Richter, 28 years old, stationed at the SS Administrative Office on Pomorska Street. He had brought his dress tunic in for adjustments in August 1920. The collar had been sitting too high, chafing his neck. He was young and impatient and had spoken to her with the casual contempt that certain men default to when addressing people they consider beneath them. He had also, she knew from her notebook, been present at the liquidation action in the Krakow ghetto in June. She had seen his name on a requisition order that one of her underground contacts had copied. He had signed off on the transport of 237 people. She applied the preparation to the collar lining. She used a fine brush, the kind she used for applying fabric adhesive. She worked in the early hours of the morning alone, with the curtains closed and a single lamp burning. She altered the collar. She pressed it perfectly. She folded the tunic into tissue paper and tied it with the shop's brown string. Richter collected it 2 days later. He thanked her, which surprised her. He said it fit perfectly, which was true. She had never made a poor-fitting garment in her life. 11 days later, she heard from Jadwiga, who heard these things through channels Marta did not ask about, that an SS officer on Pomorska Street had been taken to the military hospital with a cardiac episode. He had survived. He was 28 years old. Marta sat very still for a long time. Then she opened her notebook and began to plan more carefully. The dosage had been insufficient. She adjusted her formula. She was more precise about application areas, the wrist cuffs particularly, where the skin was thinner and the preparation would absorb more efficiently. She was methodical about sourcing the plant material, using Jadwiga's network of rural suppliers who thought they were providing extracts for our herbalists' preparations. She also became more selective. She was not indiscriminate. She made a list, names she had accumulated over months and years of watching, and she worked through it with the same deliberate patience she brought to a difficult alteration. The second case was Sturmbannführer Heinrich Voss, 44, the administrator responsible for the forced labor registry for the Krakow district. He died in his quarters on the night of September 27, 1942. The military physician recorded the cause as cardiac failure. He was the third German officer to die of apparent heart failure in the city in 6 weeks, but nobody had yet connected the cases, and nobody had yet thought to look at the uniforms. 3 deaths in 6 weeks. Marta tracked them in her notebook with a march she had borrowed from her father, the symbol he used for a completed order. Everything delivered, everything delivered, everything done. The man who came to find her arrived in Krakow on October 20th, 1942, 6 days after the dinner incident. His name was Kriminalinspektor Erich Haller, and he was from the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin. A specialist, not in conventional crime, but in what the Germans called irregular mortality patterns. He was 51 years old, thin, with a scholar's permanent slight stoop and eyes that moved with a restless cataloging intelligence that Marta recognized immediately when she first saw him standing in her doorway. He had brought his uniform for adjustment. The pretext was perfect. She learned later that it was entirely intentional. "I am told you are the best in the city," he said. His Polish was careful and grammatically correct, which was unusual. Most German officers either spoke no Polish at all or spoke it with the offhand brutality of someone who had learned a language purely for the purpose of giving orders. "My father was," she said. "I am adequate." He looked at the shop, at the cutting table, the dress forms, the bolts of fabric in their careful stacks, the framed certificates on the wall, with that cataloging gaze. He handed her his tunic, a criminal policy dress uniform of excellent quality. "I will need it by Friday," he said. "I have a formal occasion." She took the tunic without touching the areas she would need to touch, using a method she had practiced, holding it by the hem at the back. She said she would have it ready by Thursday. He left. She stood very still for a moment. Then she put the tunic on a hanger and did not touch it again until she had thought through everything. She had known someone would come eventually. She had known with the mathematical certainty that came from having studied the pattern herself. 3 officers, no clear cause, all stationed in the same city, all of a certain rank and function. Someone in Berlin would see it. Someone already had. She did not apply the preparation to Haller's tunic. She needed to know what he knew. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. She spent 2 days asking careful questions through the network she had spent 3 years building. She spoke to a woman who cleaned the offices at Pomorska Street. She spoke to an elderly man who delivered supplies to the German military hospital. She spoke very carefully to a young Polish clerk who worked in the records office and who had, over many months, been persuaded that certain information was worth sharing, though he was never told exactly who those people were or what the information was used for. What she learned was this: Haller had requested the pathology reports for all 3 deceased officers. He had also requested a list of all service providers used by German military personnel in the city: tailors, barbers, laundresses, suppliers of food and drink. The shop on Grodzka Street appeared on the list. So did 47 other establishments. She was one name among many, but she had been to 41 of those 47 shops herself in the months before she began her operations, assessing which owners would be capable of what she had done. She suspected Haller was doing the same thing, more systematically, more resourced, and considerably more dangerous. On the 3rd day after his visit, Haller returned to collect his tunic. It fit, as always, perfectly. He paid without comment and then lingered, looking at the shop window, as if the street outside interested him. "Do you know a woman named Jadwiga?" he asked. Marta did not pause. She did not allow any shift in her expression. She had rehearsed this moment, or variations of it, so many times in the dark hours of early morning that her response came with the flatness of practiced indifference. "The herbalist near the cloth hall? I buy dried lavender from her, for sachets." "I see." He turned from the window. "She died 2 days ago." Marta kept her hands on the fabric she was folding. "I'm sorry to hear that. She was quite old." He watched her. The silence extended 4 seconds, 5, 6. She counted them the way she counted stitches, steadily, without losing her place. "Yes," he said finally. "She was. Good afternoon." He left. That night, Marta sat at the kitchen table after Sophia was in bed, and Powell had fallen into his exhausted sleep, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was doing. She had always known, abstractly, that this would end one way or another. She had always told herself that she was willing to pay the price, and she had believed it, the way one believes things that have not yet been tested. Farge was dead. The old woman might have died of her age. She was genuinely elderly, but Marta did not think so. She thought Haller had found her through the same method Marta had used, by pulling on the thread of the preparations, following it back to the plant material, to the suppliers, to the woman who had asked about extraction methods in her herbalist's casual conversation. Marta was the next thread to pull. She had a week, perhaps less. She did three things. First, she burned the notebook. She burned it in the kitchen stove, page by page, watching the shorthand blacken and curl. It took 20 minutes, and she felt the loss of it with a physical ache. 3 years of observation, reduced to ash. Second, she completed the 4 uniforms she had in progress, none treated. They were German officers' uniforms, and she finished them with her usual precision, because a sudden change in the quality of her work would be noticed, and because she was a professional to her marrow. Third, she brought Powell into a conversation she had been protecting him from for 14 months. He was quieter than she expected. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands, the broad, careful hands of a man who worked with small, precise mechanisms, and he didn't speak for a long time. "Sophia," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "How long do we have?" "A week, maybe less." He nodded. He went to the wardrobe and removed a bicycle inner tube from the bottom shelf. Not a real inner tube, but a sealed casing that contained documents, contacts, and enough money to reach the countryside. He'd been carrying this for 2 years without telling her. She looked at it and felt a complicated rush of something that was partly relief and partly a fierce, retroactive love for his quiet and persistent preparation. "Thursday night," he said. "Can you be ready by Thursday?" "I have 2 uniforms to deliver on Thursday morning," she said. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I know," she said, "but they expect him. If I disappear without delivering, they'll look harder. If I deliver and then close the shop for the weekend, I have a cousin in Noe Soch. Everyone knows I visit her. It gives us time." He was quiet again. Then he said, "All right, Thursday." She spent Wednesday preparing those final 2 uniforms with perfect attention. One was a standard service tunic for a Wehrmacht signals officer who, as far as she could determine from her now destroyed records, had no specific atrocity to his name beyond the general one of wearing a uniform in the service of the occupation. She delivered it clean. The second was a dress tunic belonging to SS Sturmbannführer Walter Kessler, 47, the man responsible for selecting which prisoners from Montelupich Street were transferred to camps and which were released. Her network had told her his selection rate, the percentage he chose to release, was among the lowest in the district. She treated the collar lining in the cuffs with her most potent preparation. She worked at 2 in the morning with the precision of long practice. She pressed the tunic until it was perfect. She tied it in tissue paper and brown string, and she set it on the delivery table with a small card that said, "Ready for collection." Kowitz. Then she went upstairs and packed 2 suitcases. They left Krakow on Thursday evening in the flatbed truck of a man named Joseph, who moved produce between the city and the surrounding villages and who had been paid, over many months, for exactly this kind of emergency passage. Sophia slept under a canvas tarp wedged between her mother and a crate of late-season turnips. Marta did not sleep. She watched the city recede through a gap in the canvas. The castle on the hill, the church spires, the blue-gray darkness of the river, and she felt the city release her with a kind of exhausted grief. She had loved it all her life. She had watched it become unrecognizable. She did not know if she would see it again. In the following weeks, the German military administration in Krakow noted several developments. Criminal Inspector Erich Haller submitted a report to Berlin suggesting that a systematic, premeditated poisoning campaign had been conducted against German military personnel, using contact toxins applied to uniform fabric. The report recommended an investigation into all military tailoring establishments in occupied Poland. The report was received, classified, and substantially buried, not because Haller was wrong, but because his superiors calculated that acknowledging the possibility of a systematic poisoning campaign by a single civilian operative would be catastrophic for morale. The deaths were reclassified as cardiac events of unknown origin. SS Sturmbannführer Walter Kessler died on the afternoon of October 31, 1942, at the Krakow Military Hospital. The cause was recorded as acute cardiac failure. He was 47 years old. The shop on Grodska Street was searched on November 1st. It was empty. The dress form stood bare. The cutting table was clean. The bolts of fabric remained in their ordered stacks because Marta had left them. She had taken only the tools small enough to fit in a suitcase and the technical knowledge that would stay with her regardless. Haller examined the shop himself. He found nothing that constituted direct evidence. He found a broken needle on the cutting table and a small ceramic pot of what appeared to be fabric adhesive, which he sent to Berlin for analysis. The analysis confirmed it was fabric adhesive. The active preparation had been stored in a separate container she had buried in the garden of a woman she trusted, 6 weeks before Haller's arrival. He never solved the case, though he spent 14 months trying. Marta and Powell and Zofia reached a village in the Beskid Mountains by November. They lived there under different names. The documents from Powell's inner tube were good, the work of someone careful and experienced, with a farming family who asked no questions and offered considerable safety in exchange for Marta's skills as a seamstress and Powell's mechanical abilities. She did not make German uniforms in the mountains. She made what was needed: practical winter clothing, mended boots, darned wool stockings, a small christening gown for the farmer's new granddaughter in December 1942. She worked in the kitchen in the evenings by lamplight, and her hands were steady, and she thought less about what she had left in Krakow than she would have expected. She thought often about Jadwiga, about Tomasz, about the 237 names on Richter's transport order, names she had never known individually but carried abstractly, the way you carry a number that you cannot make small enough to fit inside the ordinary dimensions of a human life. Powell found her one evening staring at the fire without her work in her hands, which was unusual enough to concern him. Was it worth it? He asked. It was the question she had been turning over for months. She picked up her needle. She thought about Kessler's selection rate, about Voss's labor registry, about the 47 other shops on Haller's list, and all the quiet parallel lives of people making small decisions in the spaces the occupation left them. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't regret knowing I tried." He sat down beside her and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. The war ended in May 1945. Marta returned to Krakow in August of that year, after a journey that took 6 weeks and required 4 different travel documents and the assistance of people whose names she would never write down. The shop on Grodska Street was intact. It had been used as a storage facility for German administrative records in the final months of the war, and someone had used the cutting table as a desk. There were ink stains she never fully removed, but the dress forms were still there, and the shelves and the frame of the thing her father had built. She reopened the shop in September 1945. She did not advertise what she had done during the war. This was partly pragmatic. The post-war political landscape of Poland was not a place where drawing attention to yourself was wise. And partly something else, a belief that the work had been its own justification, that it did not require a story told to others to make it real or meaningful. She built a business again. She trained apprentices. She made the kind of clothing that marked the occasions of other people's lives, the suits worn to job interviews, the dresses worn to weddings, the small careful suits made for the children of those who could afford them. She charged fairly and worked without shortcuts because she was her father's daughter and because she believed, even after everything, perhaps especially after everything, that what your hands made was a kind of testimony. Zofia grew up and became an architect. Powell repaired bicycles until he was 68, and then retired to grow vegetables, which he did with the same methodical patience he had brought to everything else. Marta worked into her 70s. She died in 1991, 6 weeks after the Soviet collapse, as if she had been waiting to see whether the world that emerged from the long shadow of the 20th century would be worth examining. She left behind the tools of her trade, a shop that had been operating for 55 years, and a small cardboard box found in the lining of a winter coat she had hung at the back of a wardrobe and never worn. In the box were 2 items: a dried sprig of monkshood, its purple flowers long faded to brown, and a piece of paper folded into quarters. The paper contained a list of names, written in a shorthand that her daughter could not read, and that took a researcher at the Krakow University History Department 3 years to partially decode. 7 names, 7 German officers. Beside each name, a date and a small mark. The mark, the researcher eventually determined, was the symbol used by Marta's father for a completed order. Everything delivered. Everything delivered. Whether all 7 outcomes were directly connected to her operations was never definitively established. The wartime medical records were incomplete, the forensic trail cold by 50 years, and Haller's buried report was not declassified until 2003. What was established was the pattern, the preparation, the patience, the absolute precision of a woman who understood that the most dangerous weapon available to someone with no weapons was the thing she already knew how to do better than anyone else in the city. There is no memorial to Marta Ostrowski on Grodzka Street. There is no plaque, no archive exhibit. What remains is the shop itself, still a tailor's shop under different ownership, and the sense, if you stand there long enough, that the space has a particular quality of attention, a stillness, the kind that belongs to someone who learned early and kept always the same fundamental discipline, to watch, to wait, to be still, and to know exactly what your hands were doing. History rarely remembers the people who worked in the margins of catastrophe with nothing but skill and patience, and the quiet daily refusal to accept that helplessness was the only possible condition. It forgets them not because their actions were small, but because they were done so precisely that they left almost no trace. Marta Ostrowski left a sprig of monkshood and a list of 7 names. That was enough.